Hello, this is Lecture 5 in the Linguistic Anthropology course developed by Language Lab. The lecture is titled Key Milestones in Human Evolutionary History. In this session, we will examine the major anatomical developments, emerging skills, and behavioral changes observed in the evolutionary trajectory of Homo sapiens and their ancestors. We will classify these milestones according to their potential significance as catalysts for the emergence of language and human consciousness. But first, as usual, let us briefly summarize the conclusions from the previous session. 1. Encephalization led to an increase in neuronal density, which in turn facilitated the emergence of spandrel mirror neuronal structures in the brain. These structures caused perception to become trapped within internal mental space, resulting in a form of cognitive dysfunction. The mental images that became fixed in this internal space required evacuation; they needed to be transformed into external stimuli. Language emerged as a mechanism to address this dysfunction by externalizing these trapped mental representations in the form of object names within external reality. 2. The neurological dysfunction in hominins intensified around 100,000 years ago, particularly among Homo sapiens. By 75,000 years ago, many individuals across various populations exhibited signs of recurrent cognitive disturbances. Artistic practices were ultimately insufficient to stabilize the increasingly unstable perceptual mechanisms. 3. Around 60,000 to 50,000 years ago, a small and isolated group of Homo sapiens, likely among the last surviving representatives of their species, invented language as a highly specific and effective remedy for cognitive dysfunction. This development occurred as the result of a confluence of several extremely rare and contingent events. 4. The language solution was based on the echo effect. Two or more individuals synchronized their emotional states through shared vocalizations, effectively echoing one another. In doing so, they collectively perceived the trapped mental image which was being externalized through these vocal expressions, as an external entity, rather than as a recursive construct within their minds. The sonic echo in the external environment effectively replaced the internal neuronal echo within the mental loop. This process alleviated the cognitive dysfunction; however, as a consequence, it led to the perception of external objects as possessing their own intentionality. 5. Deep caves served as ideal environments for practicing the newly acquired linguistic ability. Echo-rich galleries allowed individuals to relieve themselves of mental images even in the absence of the others, by vocalizing into the reverberating space. Let us now begin our investigation. Our subfamily is known as the hominini or hominins, formerly referred to as hominidae or hominids. It emerged approximately 7 million years ago, diverging from the lineage that led to modern chimpanzees, a fact well established in paleoanthropology. Over the subsequent millions of years, this subfamily produced numerous genera, which appeared and vanished in waves, with many species arising and disappearing within those genera. The hominins underwent a series of significant developmental milestones, each of which endowed them with a particular anatomical feature, skill, or behavioral trait. In this investigation, we seek to explore the relationship between these changes and the eventual emergence of language and consciousness in Homo sapiens, recognizing that some of these developments may have been relevant, while others may have had little or no bearing on this outcome. Thus, we begin. The first major milestone in human evolution is bipedalism. The prevailing scientific consensus is that proto-humans became bipedal around 7 million years ago, though some studies suggest even earlier dates, possibly 9 or even 11 million years ago. An early ape recently discovered in Germany, Danuvius guggenmosi, dated to 11.6 million years ago, exhibited bipedal traits, suggesting that the origins of upright locomotion may extend further back in time than previously assumed. Bipedalism has influenced the evolution of the articulatory apparatus, as the upright posture resulted in the descent of the larynx and reshaping of the vocal tract, and arguably contributed to new cognitive behavior. But it was not in any way decisive in the emergence of language and symbolic thinking. Bipedalism most likely arose from the need to gradually transition from an arboreal habitat to life in more open savanna spaces. Indeed, modern orangutans and chimpanzees occasionally move upright, suggesting that this locomotion was not uniquely transformative. Our conclusion is as follows: bipedalism provided certain anatomical predispositions that made the technical production of speech possible, but it had no direct connection to symbolic thinking or to language as a cognitive method. Milestone 2. Let us now consider tool making. There is a tendency to associate this development with the emergence of bipedalism, which freed the hands from manual labor. This allows for a teleological continuum of traits and skills that ultimately contributed to the development of language. However, it is worth examining whether this assumption truly holds. There are two influential, but distinct theories in cognitive neuroscience and evolutionary anthropology that connect the origins of language to manual activity. The gesture-first theory proposes that language evolved initially through manual gestures. In contrast, the tool-use language co-evolution hypothesis suggests that the cognitive and neural capacities developed for tool-making also supported the emergence of language. While these theories differ in their proposed mechanisms and evolutionary trajectories, both underscore the central role of manual activity, and particularly the hands, in the emergence of language. The connection is supported by neuroimaging studies, which show that some of the same, or adjacent areas in the brain are activated during both tool use and speech production. But let us face facts, the so-called Mode 1 tools, simple stone axes associated with the Oldowan industry, appeared around 2.6 million years ago. Even earlier artifacts, dated to 3.3 million years ago, were discovered at the Lomekwi 3 site, in West Turkana. None of these, of course, were produced by Homo sapiens, but by earlier hominin species, who over the course of millions of years of existence, left no evidence of possessing language or symbolic thought. It should be noted that some modern primates also use tools, and even make tools designed for the production of other tools. As paleoanthropologist Ian Tattersall observes, the appearance of a new technology does not necessarily correspond with the emergence of a new hominin species. To this, we would add that the appearance of a new technology is even less likely to coincide with the emergence of a species endowed with symbolic thought and language. The common adage, "work made us human," lacks precision, it omits the qualifier, creative. Early tool-making lacked creativity, it was highly repetitive. The same tool forms were produced for millions of years and moreover, sometimes in such vast quantities, that modern researchers remain puzzled. Some archaeological sites contain enormous accumulations of these tools, as if they were stockpiled without any clearly identifiable purpose or practical use. Our conclusion is as follows. Tool making does not appear to have had a decisive link to the emergence of the speech faculty. The potential overlaps in neurological pathways between language and hand motor regions may be a result of routines that developed after the emergence of language, or they may reflect associations between language zones and zones regulating earlier artistic activities. Thus, it may not have been the development of the hand motor regions that conditioned the emergence of language, but rather the brain's attempts to find a solution to the neurological dysfunction that ultimately remodeled these hand motor regions, creating language zones overlaps with them. Milestone 3. Our next milestone is fire. Although evidence suggests that hominins used fire as early as 1.6 to 2 million years ago, the regular and intentional use of fire for cooking food appears only around 400,000 to 500,000 years ago. While fire enhanced caloric efficiency and supported brain growth, it did not by itself create new brain functions. Contrary to popular narratives, such as those in Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens, neither fire-based hunting nor fire-based predator defense leads directly to human uniqueness. Many hominin species before Homo sapiens used fire, yet did not possess language and consciousness, and eventually went extinct. Fire holds a special place in our imagination as a symbol of the civilized home, and it is difficult to avoid falling into an anthropomorphic fallacy in this regard. The association between fire and, for example, storytelling, is more of a romantic projection. Fire was not an actual evolutionary turning point. Our conclusion is as follows. While the use of fire provided additional calories to support brain growth, this growth created a problem for the brain that nearly led to the extinction of the species. It was only due to a highly improbable and fortunate confluence of circumstances that language and symbolic thinking were discovered, ultimately saving humanity. In retrospect, the emergence of language might be seen as an accident, an improbable solution to a profound cognitive malfunction. It was this malfunction, rather than language itself, that the mastery of fire directly contributed to. Milestone 4. Let us now examine hominin migrations. Perhaps the wandering spirit of our ancestors reflected an emerging drive for knowledge and discovery, traits that would come to characterize modern humans. Multiple waves of migration out of Africa occurred prior to the emergence of Homo sapiens species. The first such wave happened around 2 million years ago and involved one of our predecessors, possibly Homo ergaster or Homo erectus. Archaeological evidence places their presence in regions as distant as China, 1.5 million years ago, and Georgia, 1.8 million years ago. A second wave happened between 780,000 and 135,000 years ago. It is associated with Homo antecessor, a presumed ancestor of Homo sapiens. This lineage also led to Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia. Despite possessing fire, social organization, and hunting skills, these groups did not survive. Only the third wave of migration, by Homo sapiens around 54,000 to 45,000 years ago, resulted in a dominant global presence. One way or another, the spirit of wanderlust was not, in itself, a defining marker of emerging humanness, as evidenced by the fate of earlier roaming hominin populations, all of which ultimately died out without achieving any exceptional or dominant status within the planet's biota. Roaming the Earth, therefore, is more of a side story to language emergence, however much we may be tempted to project the archetypal travels of Odysseus onto our prehistoric past. Our conclusion is as follows. Proto-human long-range migrations were unrelated to symbolic thought and language, and showed no evidence of serving as precursors to true humanness. Milestone 5. Another important milestone includes the development of skills associated with early human civilization, the use of clothing, the creation of composite tools and weapons, and the establishment of organized campsites. These behaviors appeared from 400,000 years ago, with huts, 400,000 years, javelins, 350,000 years, hide processing tools, 300,000 years, and composite weapons and tools, 150,000 to 100,000 years ago. Yet these innovations too were shared by other hominins, Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, and other species lacking symbolic culture and language. These technologies, though impressive, did not produce speech or human consciousness in these species. As paleoanthropologist Ian Tattersall writes, there are ways other than our own to be an intelligent hominin. This insight underscores the distinction between intelligence and symbolic cognition and reinforces the point that even advanced tool use or social behavior does not imply the presence of language or symbolic thought. We are led to conclude that it is possible to carry out this complex activities without necessarily having developed language or modern human-like consciousness. Our conclusion is as follows. These abilities, in and of themselves, are not related to symbolic thinking and language. Milestone 6. The next major milestone is the rich and complex domain of prehistoric art. We will pause here for a more detailed examination. It becomes increasingly difficult to deny the presence of symbolic cognition among our ancestors, once we are confronted with clear evidence of artistic expression within their communities. The central question, however, is whether the early manifestations of symbolic capacity constituted the initial steps in a continuous, teleological progression toward language and consciousness, or whether they were, in fact, distress signals, symptomatic of a profound dysfunction in the Homo sapiens brain, and ultimately an unsuccessful attempt to cope with it. Within the framework proposed here, we adopt a novel and unconventional perspective. We propose that instances of mental dysfunction among hominins became increasingly frequent and more intense, beginning around 100,000 years ago. The earliest responses to intrusive mental imagery, i.e., vivid and involuntary representations perceived as alien, inappropriate, or even infectious, were likely marked by feelings of disgust and a desperate impulse to expel or externalize these intruding entities. Such efforts may have included shouting, spitting, striking external objects, engaging in bodily convulsions or violent gesticulations, or otherwise attempting to drive the images out of the mind, as well as devising ways to protect oneself from their perceived intrusion. Crucially, when any trace of these expulsive actions left a visible mark outside the individual, it was likely experienced as a sign of success in these efforts and may have brought a brief sense of relief. We argue that such embodied responses to internal cognitive disturbances formed the foundational basis of early artistic expression. In this view, the origins of art are deeply rooted in the primal struggle to manage and materialize disruptive mental phenomena. However, it is also important to emphasize the ultimate ineffectiveness of early artistic methods in overcoming mental dysfunction. The central problem lay in the fact that the products of these practices were themselves perceived by the mind. As a result, the attempted objectification of the intrusive mental image was inherently unstable. The image, now accompanied by its symbolic representation, was reabsorbed into the mind, remaining imprisoned within the very cognitive space it sought to escape. We suggest that the earliest artistic endeavors were, indeed, unsuccessful attempts to counteract mental regression. Subsequent cave art, particularly cave paintings, functioned as a practice associated with the production of echoes within cave galleries. Later, Upper Paleolithic art marked a shift toward the sacralization of language and its beneficial role in mitigating mental dysfunction. However, at none of these stages can art be said to have caused language, or to have directly led to its emergence. If art contributed to the development of language, it did so only instrumentally at certain points, functioning as a supportive tool within an already established framework for language production. We now turn to a more detailed examination of these claims. The earliest evidence of symbolic behavior, such as the deliberate collection of visually striking stones like jasper, quartz, opal, and obsidian, which had no apparent practical function, can be traced back as far as 2 to 3 million years ago. The collection and use of pigments began around 500,000 years ago. A shell engraved with zigzag markings, dated to approximately 500,000 years ago, and attributed to Homo erectus, was discovered at Trinil in Java. Neanderthals left us only a few inscrutable markings, and some traces of ochre applied to cave walls, while other hominin species contributed virtually nothing in terms of decoration or visual art. All of the aforementioned artworks remained rare occurrences, with artistic inclinations expressed very tentatively and without assurance. We interpret these early artistic expressions as evidence of a disturbance gaining momentum within the perceptual mechanisms of hominins, though still manifesting itself sporadically, affecting only isolated individuals within the community and only with minimal intensity. By painting the body, an individual may have sought to protect himself from intrusive images that tried to invade his mind. Alternatively, body painting may have served as a way to externalize the psyche, projecting it onto the surface of the body through painted symbols. Another possibility is that, through body painting, the individual constructed an alternative version of the self, an imagined other, who bore the burden of these redundant mental images and the associated disturbances. Amulets, masks, and early forms of decoration likely served similar purposes. The fascination with unusual stones may be interpreted as the symbolic attribution of mental imagery to visually striking objects, assigning to them the role of displaced or externalized mental content. Certain gestures or movements in space, precursors of ritualistic dances, may have been attempted as a means of dispelling intrusive or persistent mental images. The simplest means of relieving the mind of excess imagery may have been to externalize it through a series of vocalizations, bodily sways, or, alternatively, quick repetitive scratches or notches made on any available surface. The earliest artistic productions may thus reflect compulsive behaviors, ritualized discharges of surplus cognitive tension. These are not merely decorative or symbolic, but may originate from evolved hazard precaution systems. As cognitive anthropologists Boyer and Leonard argue, such behaviors stem from a specific suite of mental programs that manage potential threats by generating highly structured, often rigid actions, a system that overlaps neurologically with modern obsessive-compulsive behaviors. From this perspective, the obsessive impulse to externalize mental images through repeated gestures, markings, or vocalizations can be seen as the foundational logic behind repetition and cyclicality, central markers of distinctly human behavior, reflected in traditional artistic expressions, such as the patterned motifs of early pottery and architecture, the recurring movements of traditional dance, and the cyclical structures of musical composition. Modern compulsive behaviors aimed at managing anxiety or cognitive overload may be also seen as a recurrence of this primordial condition of the ancestral psyche. We might even be tempted to discern the legacy of this obsessive, repetitive behavior in the logical structures underlying human reasoning, which privileges analogy, classification by similarity, and equivalence. artistic expression began to spread more widely around 82,000 to 75,000 years ago, as evidenced by perforated shells from Morocco, beads from Blombos Cave, and other early forms of jewelry, including pendants, teeth, discs, and rings. These belonged exclusively to our species. Between approximately 45,000 and 12,000 years ago, there was a remarkable proliferation of complex artworks, including exquisite cave paintings, intricately decorated tools, bas-reliefs, figurines, and other forms of symbolic expression, all produced exclusively by Homo sapiens. This period, known as the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, unfolded, if not entirely disruptively, then swiftly enough to suggest an abrupt shift in artistic preferences, raising legitimate questions as to whether some form of catalytic agent may have accelerated the process. We propose that the catalytic agent at work was language. The emergence of linguistic structures began to frame and mediate human perception of reality. We offer the following explanation for this phenomenon. When language was eventually discovered, which happened according to our hypothesis, around 60 to 50,000 years ago and without any direct continuity from earlier artistic practices, artistic expression persisted, but no longer as a practical response to cognitive dysfunction alternative to language. Artistic expression subsequently evolved through two consecutive stages. Initially, for a relatively brief period, it functioned as a technical support mechanism for establishing the practice of language use, specifically, by producing tangible objects within the cave to accompany the practice of echo production in its galleries. Later, once linguistic practices were fully established, artistic expression assumed a sanctifying role, serving to consecrate the newly formed capacity for language. This last stage of the cave art marks the time when there was no longer a need to materialize a unique, proprietary symbol for each individual mental image on a cave wall. The task of individuation was now reliably performed by specific vocalizations. The material representations on the cave walls could instead be aggregated, functioning so to speak, as a generalized symbol of symbols, reproducing for the entire community the very act of symbolizing, and perhaps also offering symbolic composites representing particular categories of mental images. What has just been said does not imply that there may not be markings on prehistoric cave walls that predate the emergence of language, and thus belong to a period characterized by languageless attempts to externalize mental imagery. However, beginning with the Upper Paleolithic, the cave becomes the primary site where visual art is practiced through a ritualized and sacralized mode of expression, one that is fundamentally shaped by linguistic structures. Archaeological research indicates that images on exterior rock surfaces, in the open air, begin to appear primarily during the Mesolithic period, around 12,000 to 7,500 before Common Era, and more prominently during the Neolithic, 7,500 to 4,500 before Common Era, thus appearing significantly later than deep cave art. Such images are extremely rare in the Paleolithic, when all of the images are found inside the caves. The exterior rock art thus emerged significantly later, after the ritual use of dark cave interiors had already been well established. The transition of artistic activity into open-air settings may signify in part a shift toward freer, more individualistic modes of expression, a form of true art in the modern sense, which aspires, although unsuccessfully in our view, to serve as an alternative to language. Returning to the origins of this process, the resonant darkness of the cave, the interplay of shadow and echo, created an ideal environment for the ritual externalization of mental images, allowing for the projection of internal cognitive content into shared space on the wall. The flickering torchlight would have animated the images, making them appear to move. What was once a painful, intrusive mental object was now given form and presence outside the mind, vivid, embodied, living its own life. To this, we must add the cave artists' deliberate use of wall morphology, exploiting natural features of the rock to enhance the figurative quality of their images. The fusion of image and surface topography not only heightened the visual impact, but also contributed to the psychological effect. The image, anchored to the contours of the cave wall, acquired a sense of stability and permanence. Symbolically, the image seemed to be anchored into the stone, secured outside the mind and protected from re-internalization. The stone wall functioned, symbolically and experientially, as a heavy anchor, holding the mental image firmly in place, external to the mind. Within the framework of our theory, it becomes possible to account for many features of prehistoric art that have puzzled researchers for decades. In what follows, we will enumerate several of these features and offer brief commentary on how they can be interpreted through the lens of our theoretical approach. A. Prehistoric art features a highly selective subject matter. It depicts mostly animals, while representations of humans, plants, insects, and other forms of life are exceedingly rare. B. The bestiary itself is limited, typically comprising only about a dozen animal species. Among these, a few dominate: the horse, the bison, the ibex, mountain goat. Other animals such as the mammoth, deer, and auroch, a wild bull, are relatively rare, while predators like the lion, and rhinoceros and bear are statistically scarce. C. It is not uncommon to find heads and limbs of the animals to be outlined multiple times, as if the artist had not yet decided where or how to depict a particular body part. Anatomical features are often selectively rendered, some are exaggerated, others entirely neglected. Subtle or barely visible details, even those we might consider insignificant, are highlighted, while particular postures are depicted with remarkable precision, and others are completely omitted. D. There is, in essence, no story being told. Despite the efforts of some researchers to detect narrative sequences, the images lack narratological composition. The vast majority of animal and other images are incomplete, fragmented and interwoven. They often overlap, they are painted one atop another, they appear to be arranged in a chaotic manner, dispersed irregularly across the rock surface. Rather than presenting a coherent visual narrative or a meticulously planned composition, the overall pano usually evokes a sense of artistic improvisation or performative action. This suggested to many researchers that the act of painting itself was central to the ritual practice. E. A special word has to be said about the enigmatic abstract signs that often accompany the paintings. There are two types of them. The first type seems primitive, chaotic, or impulsive. These signs also frequently overlap with animal figures. The second group includes more carefully executed signs, with consistent shapes and deliberate positioning, suggesting symbolic significance with possible syntactic or modulatory function. As paleoanthropologist Genevieve von Petzinger observes, out of the hundreds of geometric signs that could have been created, Upper Paleolithic people across Europe kept choosing the same ones, again and again, for over 30,000 years. Panels composed entirely of geometric signs are not uncommon, though more often they accompany depictions of animals. The two systems, the representational and the sign symbolic, seem to be interwoven. The abstract signs likely serve to modify, intensify, or recontextualize the emotion carried by the animal symbol, functioning as an early form of symbolic inflection or visual predication. F. Finally, there are hand imprints. The earliest known handprints in cave art, both negative, stenciled, and positive, painted, date back to at least 64,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. Research has shown that these handprints belong to individuals of all sexes and age groups, indicating that the practice was widespread and held collective importance. They are found across the globe, in regions that could not have been in direct contact with one another, owing to both temporal and geographical separation. These are some of the peculiar features of prehistoric art that have long puzzled researchers. In what follows, we will offer explanations for them within the framework of our theory. The limited range of represented subjects in prehistoric art and the highly stylized manner of their depiction suggest a conventional character to these representations, that is, they were symbolic rather than mimetic. We propose that the exquisite cave art of the Magdalenian period, 18,000 to 11,000 years ago, reflects a deep symbiosis between visual art and language. Once language began to spread among Homo sapiens populations, the older practice of addressing cognitive dysfunction through vocal expression accompanied by a visual image transformed into a ritual act. In this context, art became a form of ritual observance, what might be described as a re-enactment of the moment of language discovery, of the first symposium, a symbolic act of collective exorcism of redundant mental images. The ritual specialist or priest likely painted multiple animals in a single session, often layering them one over another without regard for compositional coherence. Aesthetic arrangement or narratology were not his concerns. Frequently, earlier depictions were left unfinished, abandoned mid-process, as he attempted to achieve a sense of stability in the externalized mental image. When that stability failed to materialize, he would simply begin again. The limited repertoire of animal figures and the repeated practice of rendering them in a standardized, stylized form made the task relatively efficient. Even highly refined shapes could be reproduced with ease and fluency. All of this suggests that the artist's goal was not aesthetic representation, but emotional resolution. When a symbolic gesture failed to bring relief, a new one was made immediately atop it. As also archaeologists Lewis O. Williams and Dowson suggest, many of the most puzzling features of cave art, overlapping figures, unfinished images, and repeated forms, are best understood as reflections of altered states of consciousness in which the wall becomes a screen for projecting internal visions. In this view, the act of painting was performative and therapeutic, a ritual effort to stabilize overwhelming internal imagery through symbolic projection. By this stage, as we pointed it out before, the depictions of animals used in the rituals no longer corresponded to specific, individual mental images, but instead represented generalized, shared themes. An exception may have been the priest himself, who, as an intermediary between the group and reality, continued to externalize personal mental content in the course of the ritual. This may account for the impulsive, even obsessive atmosphere conveyed by the overlapping and often unfinished images. They leave the impression that the artist was overtaken by a kind of frenzy, an urgent attempt to attain a particular mental or emotional state. Hand imprints align particularly well with the framework of our theory. This form of expression likely predated language. It represents one of the earliest attempts to externalize internal mental imagery. The gesture is strikingly direct. By placing the image of one's hand on the cave wall, the individual effectively externalized a part of the self, charged with the weight of unarticulated, torturous, mental content, onto an external surface. Its simplicity and repeatability made it a potent symbolic act. It elegantly fuses individual expression with a universally recognizable symbol. Through this act, anyone could assume the role of a priest, projecting a deeply personal mental image while simultaneously producing an identical, collective representation. It is quite likely that this act was performed simultaneously by many individuals, transforming it into a collective ritual of self-expression and symbolic cohesion. In this way, the shared gesture became both a personal imprint and a communal affirmation, blurring the boundaries between individual experience and group identity. Following the emergence of language, the practice of leaving handprints was embedded in communal ritual, likely accompanied by collective chanting and other performative elements. The abstract geometric signs, found on the walls and stones, can be explained in a similar manner. Before proceeding, a brief note of caution is warranted. It is tempting to suggest, as many modern scholars indeed do, that prehistoric signs were precursors to writing, an early system of shared symbols, perhaps a proto-hieroglyphic set, or even a proto-alphabet. However, we argue that such conclusions are likely overstated. While the standardized and abstract signs may have held shared symbolic significance for prehistoric humans, functioning analogously to religious icons reproduced and carried by individuals or groups, we do not interpret them as direct forerunners of written language. Rather, we propose that the use and repetition of these signs played a significant role in advancing symbolic thought among early humans. It was only much later, and within a limited number of societies, that this specific cognitive capacity contributed to the emergence of written language, developed primarily for utilitarian purposes, such as record keeping and the management of resources. Let us now attempt to interpret the abstract prehistoric signs in greater detail, within the framework of our theoretical model. The first group of signs, coarse, primitive, and disordered incisions, scratches, points, and cupules, can be attributed to the pre-language period, when individuals experienced an obsessive impulse to leave repetitive marks on surfaces. Some of these rude marks accompany later naturalistic images, as some forms of former obsessive behaviors may have persisted into the beginning of the language period. Alternatively, when we encounter depictions of animal bodies covered with lines, horizontal and vertical, intersecting or parallel, we may interpret them as efforts to trap a more elaborate extrapolation of internal imagery in the external world, to affix it securely to the cave wall. The researcher of prehistoric art Henri-Edouard Prosper Broyle proposed in a similar vein that the intersecting lines over animal figures functioned as traps for evil spirits. We assume that with the emergence of language, the rituals performed in the caves gradually required more schematization of the images, as well as signs additional to the images, with clear signification that made the images on the wall complete to the minds of the participants, or inflected the meaning of the images represented in the desired way according to a specific grammar. Signs could also help increase the efficiency of the acts, as well as in the later periods, to allow more intimate and mobile services to be performed also in the open air, with the replicas of these imagery codified in signs painted on portable flat stones or pieces of rock. This suggestion is supported by the archaeological evidence. Beginning around 12,000 years ago, cave art declines, and new artistic media emerge, such as decorated pebbles, microliths, and embellished tools. We begin to see a proliferation of portable, abstract, and symbolic objects, along with a noticeable shift from naturalistic representation to more abstract forms, including repetitive geometric signs. While we cannot speak of an abrupt replacement of figurative art by abstract art during the transition from the Magdalenian period, around 18,000 to 12,000 years ago, to the Azilian period, around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, there is clear evidence of diversification in artistic expression, both in form and in medium. The direction of this diversification cannot be explained solely by successive waves of new settlers, imposing one cultural layer upon another. Our conclusion regarding prehistoric art is that artistic expression serves as a definitive marker of nascent symbolic thought and the emergence of humanness in our ancestors. Other hominin species may have experienced analogous forms of neurological dysfunction, perhaps less pronounced than in Homo sapiens, due to differences in brain size and neural architecture, which may nonetheless have contributed to their eventual extinction. Their decline, therefore, may not be solely attributed to external competition with Homo sapiens, but also to an unresolved internal cognitive challenge. With the emergence of language, artistic expression did not disappear but rather persisted in a transformed role. It became a means of supporting and sacralizing the linguistic method of externalizing mental imagery. We argue that artistic expression, while continuing to evolve, increasingly came to reinforce and legitimize the symbolic structures introduced by language. An important implication of this view is that art, from its earliest ritual forms to the present, does not constitute an alternative mode of cognition in opposition to language, as is often claimed. Rather, it functions as an instrument for enriching and amplifying the emotional resonance of existing linguistic structures, sacralizing them, yet ultimately affirming their symbolic authority. Milestone 7. The final evolutionary milestone we will examine is ritualistic burial. Did other hominins, apart from Homo sapiens, bury their dead with any indication of ritualistic intent? And more broadly, do other animal species engage in burial, or exhibit behaviors resembling mourning for the dead? Although such claims are occasionally made, there remains no convincing evidence that other hominin species engaged in deliberate symbolic rituals associated with burial. Neanderthals occasionally buried their dead. Claims exist for Homo naledi 335,000 to 236,000 years ago, and possibly Homo heidelbergensis, Cima de los Huesos, 430,000 years ago. Yet none of these cases demonstrate clear symbolic ritual. Although some non-human animals exhibit behaviors that resemble certain aspects of mortuary care, these behaviors appear to be driven by social, hygienic, or protective instincts rather than by symbolic meaning, or concepts such as the afterlife, mourning rituals, or commemoration. For example, elephants are known to display mourning-like behavior, touching, sniffing, or gently nudging the bodies of deceased herd members. In some instances, they have been observed covering corpses with branches, dirt, or leaves, although such actions are not systematic and are not considered intentional burial in the human sense, but rather a form of protective covering. Similarly, chimpanzees and gorillas sometimes display quiet, attentive behavior around the body of a deceased group member, and rare cases have been reported in which corpses were partially covered with foliage. It is commonly assumed that the first symbolic burials of Homo sapiens date to around 100,000 years ago. However, such cases are rare, and the evidence linking them to deliberate ritual behavior remains limited and not conclusive. Traces such as ochre stains, minimal grave goods, or engraved objects may be coincidental or the result of non-ritualistic activity. More convincing evidence of ritualized burial practices, does not appear until approximately 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, during the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, a period marked by the rapid and transformative expansion of Homo sapiens culture, which, as previously noted, also saw a remarkable proliferation of the arts, and which we associate with the emergence of language. Ritualized burial may represent the earliest cultural practice arising from the newly invented linguistic capacity to externalize mental imagery. What occurs when I produce a vocal sound and another person echoes it, when through joint vocalization, we synchronize our emotional states? I begin to perceive the other not as wholly separate, but as an extension of myself. The other becomes me, outside of me, part of the external world where the regression of my mental image now unfolds, and yet this external part of the world remains in some sense, me. If I come to recognize that the other replicates my mind outside of myself, then I am compelled to care for myself in the other. In death, this takes the form of caring for the body of the deceased, as a way of ensuring that the I, outside of I, does not truly vanish. Additionally, the person to whom I am emotionally closest is most likely the one with whom I most frequently synchronize emotional states through conversation, and from whom I therefore receive regular psychological relief. Such a person becomes a vital lifeline, someone whose loss would represent an existential threat I cannot afford to face. Burial thus becomes an act of preserving the continuity of myself, by soothing the perceiving mind with the comforting image of the other merely falling asleep, an image carefully staged and ritualized, to mitigate the terror of final loss, and the fear of regression of the mental image collapsing back into the unshared interiority of my mind. As sociologist and anthropologist Robert Hertz observed, the body of the deceased is not a mere corpse, it is something more. It is the object of a collective representation, and consequently it participates in a sort of sacredness. Likewise, anthropologists Bloch and Parry note that death rituals are not about closure, but about transforming grief into symbolic order, allowing the living to maintain the illusion of relational continuity. Rituals surrounding death do not resolve the trauma of loss, they reorganize the space of meaning so that the dead continue to dwell within it. Our conclusion is that burials conducted with ritualistic intent serve as a strong indicator of nascent symbolic thought and the emergence of language in early humans. We now come to the conclusion of our lecture. Let us briefly review the key milestones on our ancestors' long journey toward the discovery of language. In this process, we will revisit several key insights from earlier lectures in order to reinforce the conclusions within the framework of the overarching theory. And thus, we list our conclusions. 1. As a result of encephalization and the formation of neuronal mirror systems in the brain, early humans began to suffer from a cognitive dysfunction, the spontaneous production of mental images perceived internally. In order to stabilize their perception, they were compelled to find a method for externalizing these superfluous, internal images, placing them, as it were, back into the external world, where perception should originate. 2. The first signs of this condition may have appeared in species predating Homo sapiens, possibly over 1 million years ago. Archaeological evidence such as vast quantities of uniform stone axes could suggest a compulsive behavior disconnected from practical function. Around 500,000 years ago, the use of ochre and rare decorative elements begins to emerge, along with possible mask-wearing and potentially the earliest forms of ritual dance. These activities represent the first attempts by hominins affected by a nascent proto-reflexive consciousness to externalize mental imagery that was becoming trapped in feedback loops within the brain. 3. The neurological dysfunction intensified around 100,000 years ago, particularly among Homo sapiens. By 75,000 years ago, many individuals across various populations exhibited signs of severe cognitive disruption. Symbolic artifacts became more common, yet there was still no evidence of language. Despite their symbolic function, artistic practices were ultimately insufficient to stabilize the increasingly unstable perceptual mechanisms. A dramatic population decline ensued, culminating in a genetic bottleneck that drastically reduced the number of surviving Homo sapiens. 4. Around 60 to 50,000 years ago, a small and isolated group of Homo sapiens, likely among the last of their kind, living under specific environmental conditions, in a region somewhere in the southern part of Africa, underwent a critical mutation in the FOXP2 gene. This mutation enabled the invention of language, a versatile and effective strategy for managing the neurological dysfunction caused by self-referential circuits in the brain. The method involved externalizing an emotion-related mental image through vocalization, then receiving an echo of that vocalization from another individual, allowing the regression to be perceived not as something happening within them, but as unfolding externally, in what might be called the mind of reality. The external reality thus acquired its own intentionality. My mind begins to exist outside of myself, and the external reality, comprising the other individual who echoes me, becomes me, outside of me. The described early vocal exchanges may be seen as the first proto-conversations, primitive, yet foundational rituals of emotional alignment, whose core social function remains central in human communication to this day. 5. Over time, the intervals between vocalization and echo, the wait for the echo periods, grew longer, allowing the brain to develop tolerance for the absence of immediate vocal response. This strengthened the illusion that symbols exist independently of the self, anchored in material reality, remaining the material self outside the mental self. Yet even in modern humans, if the delay between the utterance and its echo becomes too long, the risk of mental regression, the re-internalization of the torturous chaos of mental imagery, remains real, threatening severe psychological distress and potentially leading to irreparable psychic pathologies. 6. Having invented language, the isolated group of Homo sapiens, endowed with its adaptive genomic profile, rapidly expanded and colonized new regions of the African continent. Their descendants launched the third great exodus out of Africa and instigated what we now call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. 7. Deep caves served as ideal environments for practicing the newly acquired linguistic ability. Echo-rich galleries allowed individuals to relieve themselves of mental images, even in the absence of the others, by vocalizing into the reverberating space. 8. Artistic practices, which predated language and had ultimately failed to resolve the cognitive dysfunction, evolved according to a different logic after the emergence of language, becoming a supportive tool to affirm the language's legitimacy and effectiveness as a method for externalizing superfluous mental images and for anchoring them firmly in external reality. We propose that Upper Paleolithic cave painting was a ritualistic practice performed by designated individuals, priests, or shamans. By painting on the cave walls in the presence of a chanting community, they engaged in collective acts of exorcising, a selected set of shared mental themes, thus theatrically re-enacting the primordial event of language creation. By this time, language was already a fully developed system. These rituals were already not symposiums, in which new names were created, but rather reaffirmations of the symbolic act that had once externalized the mental image, fixing it to the cave wall and by extension, to stable reality, where it could no longer disturb the inner life of the mind. In this sense, it was an act of reverence toward external reality, bringing alleviation, and its animation, laying the groundwork for the earliest religious cults associated with animism. In the distinction between symposiums, focused on the creation of new names for practical purposes, and the ritual acts that sacralized this practice, celebrating its mind-alleviating effects, we can discern the early foundations of the divergence between the modern scientific approach to reality and its artistic or spiritual alternative. 9. These ritual acts functioned as collective reassurance, affirming to the group that the threat of mental regression had been averted. The further gradual transition from naturalistic imagery to geometric abstraction likely reflects a desire to render the exorcistic practices portable and individually accessible, a view supported by the fact that later Paleolithic complex abstract signs are predominantly found painted on a vast number of separate flat stones and rocks. 10. By the end of Upper Paleolithic, images of the natural world and abstract symbols were represented on a vast number of mobile objects, flat stones, tools, weapons, and figurines. These portable artifacts, even when highly refined, were in our view secondary to the primary ritual practices enacted within the caves, and were likely personal adaptations or derivations of those original communal rituals. 11. Finally, the emergence of burial rituals, becoming increasingly frequent around 50,000 years ago, fits coherently within the proposed theoretical framework. Once the other becomes essential to the individual for producing the echo to his or her emotional discharge, once the other becomes the self outside the self, then the death of the other, poses a unique psychological threat: the return of unshared mental imagery, and the collapse of symbolic stability. Ritual burial, then, becomes not merely a way to honor the dead, but a psychological necessity to soothe the perceiving mind by preserving the illusion that the other is not truly gone, but merely asleep, still capable of resuming their echoing function. It is fair to say that the loss of a person with whom we sustain an emotional connection through constant verbal communication is experienced as the loss of an entire world. This loss is indistinguishable from the loss of the self. Based on our analysis of the key milestones in human evolutionary history, it appears that only prehistoric art and ritualistic burials can be reliably interpreted as manifestations of a pathological development in the human brain, as well as of the early attempts by our ancestors to address this condition through the emergence of language and consciousness. Admittedly, with a degree of interpretative license, other milestones might also be considered partial effects of the same underlying causes. For instance, hominin territorial restlessness could be viewed as an externalization of a desire to escape psychological regression, expressed through physical relocation. Similarly, the mastery of fire might be interpreted as an early attempt to project the contents of the psyche into the external world. However, we contend that such interpretations exceed the boundaries of acceptable and reasoned speculation. We therefore focus on artistic expression and ritualistic burial as the two practices most directly connected to the origins of human subjectivity and language. This concludes our session for today. In our next lecture, we will examine in detail how the linguistic method of externalizing mental images gave rise to human consciousness and the concept of self. We thank you for your attention, and we look forward to continuing this exploration with you. In the following segment, we will present the reference list of the supporting literature used in preparing this lecture.